God's good limits are actually for our flourishing. They enable creativity, they enable rest, they enable purpose and joy and connection. And when we live without limits, we live exhausted, where kind of the goalposts of success are continually moving.
Hi, friends. I'm Amy Julia Becker, and this is Love is Stronger Than Fear, a podcast about pursuing hope and healing in the midst of personal pain and social division. In this season, we are talking about all things healing, personal healing, spiritual healing, social healing, and more. And today I get to talk to Ashley Hales. Ashley is an author and teacher, and today we're talking about how to experience the spaciousness of limits. Yes, you heard that right. The spaciousness of limits. This is a conversation I needed because I have found myself bumping up against my limits a lot this fall. And this is true of my whole life, but I feel like especially right now as we're kind of emerging from COVID and returning to fall sports for our kids and social activities for all of us and having events outside our home in the evening and meetings in person, it just feels like my time is more limited than ever, and yet I'm trying to pretend like that's not true. So I'm grateful for this conversation because it really helped me to pause and ask, what is it that I need to say no to? Where do I need to accept my own need for sleep or time alone or just time with my family? I'm not kidding when I say we finished this conversation and I emailed someone to say that Peter and I could not go to a party on Saturday night. And I emailed someone else to say that my daughter could not play in a soccer game after all. So, for anyone who is wrestling with too many good choices, too many demands on your time, or just a feeling of being boxed in by obligations, this conversation is for you. Well, I am here today with my friend Ashley Hales. Ashley, welcome.
Thank you. It's so fun to be here.
And we are here to talk about your new book, A Spacious Life, Trading Hustle and Hurry for the Goodness of Limits. And I just saw the title of your book, having read your previous book, so I knew you were like a good thinker and writer and whatever, but I saw the title of this book and was like, I have to have her on the show. This is so speaking to me, and I'm sure to so many other people. And I want to start by talking about this relationship between the spaciousness of the life that we're offered and the limits that are actually, you contend, crucial to that. And I was thinking about when I first saw your title, and you quote this eventually in the book, but I was thinking about the Psalm 18:19, God brought me into a spacious place. God rescued me because he delighted in me. And I love that Psalm. I've thought about it lots in my life, but I was really struck by the fact that at the beginning of your book, you quote a different Psalm. And you quote Psalm 16, 116?
Yep.
16?
Yep. 16.
Okay. The lines have fallen for me in pleasant places. And I know there's another translation that even says the boundary lines have fallen for me in pleasant places. So it's basically this one psalm about like, you've brought me into a spacious place. And then this other idea that like a pleasant place has limits that God has given us. And I feel like this whole book is really about being brought into a spacious place through the goodness of limits. And that, at least for me, as like a modern American Christian white woman, feels a little bit paradoxical.
For sure.
I would love to just start by asking, how can boundary lines and spaciousness coexist and actually be crucial to one another?
Yeah. One thing as I was kind of playing with these ideas that really kind of struck me is that limits are actually embedded in creation. And I think primarily as Americans, definitely as Westerners, we can tend to think of limits as something that, as a Christian terminology, would be because of the fall, right? That before the fall, everything was great. We could do whatever we wanted. But because of the fall into sin, then there were limits, but that limits are actually part of what makes creation good. That without limits, without boundary lines, there would be nothing, right? The world would be without form and void. And so it was the limits of the day and the night. It was the limits of the sun ruling the day, not all the time. It's the limits of planets. It's the limits of the ground seasons. And it's also the limits of human creatures too, that provided the guardrails for the flourishing of humanity. So it was, Adam and Eve weren't supposed to be like wandering everywhere. They were to tend a garden. They were to live within the bounds of a marriage covenant, like that. They weren't supposed to just be equally kind of engaged with everybody. And unfortunately, in our 21st century life, we have spread ourselves out so thinly that we've transgressed. We've gone beyond those good guardrails, those good natural human limits that God intended for our flourishing. We've bypassed them for hustle and hurry. And so really, I'm just, this is nothing new. Nothing new is in A Spacious Life. But I am hopeful that it is a gentle invitation to realizing and reimagining again how God's good limits are actually for our flourishing. They enable creativity, they enable rest, they enable purpose and joy and connection. And when we live without limits, we live exhausted, where kind of the goalposts of success are continually moving.
When our daughter Penny was first born, and as you know, and most listeners probably know, Penny was diagnosed with Down syndrome. And I remember really wrestling for a good, the first year of her life with thinking that she had like a particular brokenness to her as a result of having Down syndrome. And I finally had a friend who said to me, limitations and brokenness are not necessarily the same thing. And I think you're looking at Penny's limitations as someone who's been born with Down syndrome and thinking that that is a particular form of brokenness, and it's not necessarily. And once I started to think about like the ways that I put brokenness and limitation in the same category when they're not, like thinking about from a Christian perspective, like Jesus had limits. He was born with that in and of itself was a limit. We'll talk more about that from your book, but like Adam and Eve had limits in the garden and they were good ones. And so, and then it started to help me realize how much because in fact of being able-bodied and having a certain IQ and being given all these opportunities socially in America and whatever, how much I pushed against limits that might in fact be very much for my good. So I was like, oh, wait a second. Me ignoring, avoiding, denying limits is more a sign of brokenness than having a daughter who's been born with clear limitations is. Like, it was like flipping my whole world around, which, has been the past 15 years of my life. But I was really thinking about that both as you were speaking and as I was reading your book. And I wanted to hone in on one other point you made within this idea of like limitlessness, like how much that is an American experience, especially when it comes to the amount of choice we have every day. So it's like clothing, foods, even for some people, at least schools, jobs, where you're going to live, things that used to be more of a given are now choices. And I think even just the old phrase, like living in the land of opportunity, kind of the land of limitless choice, can also paradoxically lead to us feeling confined, stuck, paralyzed in the midst of all of our choices. So I'm curious, like, what do you think it is that makes us feel small and stuck in the midst of limitlessness, or what seems like limitlessness?
I think Brooks in The Second Mountain talks a little bit about how this is a particular problem for young adults, that they have this constant pressure to kind of make and create themselves. It's kind of like we're walking into a supermarket and there's like 2 full aisles of cereal, and they're stacked all, 6 deep and 6 high. And you're like, unless you've already said, okay, I'm going to buy the Honey Nut Cheerios and Frosted Flakes or something, like, you're just overwhelmed, right? Like you are not able to actually make good choices. And so it's really in us imposing limits on our potential limitless choice that enables us to live in the world. Otherwise we would just like have decision fatigue every second.
Right.
And so I think, there is something really important in the same way that we, if we have been afforded a level of privilege, and so therefore we have more options, is to say, what choices can I make? Like I'm walking into that cereal aisle, that is going to promote flourishing for others, for for my place, for my church community, for my family, and to not simply be like, well, I just really like the Frosted Flakes more. And so, I'm going to just stick with that, but maybe we should move on to the granola because that's actually something that's going to serve everybody better. But in other words, like that this limitless choice does cause us to shut down. And it does often mean that we retreat. And so when we do have those choices, to begin to ask how those choices might then bring more freedom for others, moving us outward from kind of this boxed in, closed off sense of, well, really life is all about me and my personal happiness and my sense of unlimited autonomy, which is what the American way tells us is a good life.
Right. Yeah, I have a quotation from you on page 7. But you wrote, "The way into a more spacious life was through a doorway I didn't want to enter, right through my limits." And I'd love to just hear some of your story, like what brought you to this place, and even in what you were just saying, like what types of choices have you started to make that might look different than the past? But again, like what brought you here? How did you get there?
Well, I think a lot of it was, I grew up similarly in the sense that, fed on a diet of world changing, whether that's kind of a Christian version or just your upwardly mobile, white, middle class American. And there was a sense that I had succeeded in high school and college and onto my graduate degree. And my husband and I lived overseas. And so there was a sense, in our early 20s that life was our oyster. And, and then of course you find out it's not. Usually most people a lot earlier. But, I think some of it was just, the limitations of our careers at that point. We then, having children and a few surprise children, that we weren't quite planning as many or quickly. And, so I experienced, the limitations on my body, in early motherhood, a whole lot. Yeah. And feeling like, but wait, I'm supposed to be the smart one and the accomplished one. And all I'm doing is like making half a peanut butter and jelly sandwich for myself today. And sweeping under the toddler high chair 800 times a day. Like, what am I doing with my life? And so I think, I had a lot of years where I was angry at that reality with God. And, I think now that my children are teens and all in school, I kind of have a little bit more perspective too on those earlier years of motherhood as character forming. And I in some ways, I wish I would have seen them in the moment as, if all of my life is really to be given back to God in worship, like the point isn't if I'm writing academic articles right now, or quote unquote successful right now in my career, the point is, am I connected to God? And how can I be present to God and myself and others in life-giving ways, even in the limits that I have? And so I think in the last year and a half, we've all slowed down a little bit and we've all felt our finitude in new ways. And to see it as an invitation instead of something to fight back has been something that has felt really freeing. It's made me less anxious and more confident that God's good and he's going to do what he wants. And I don't have to work it up to do so.
Yeah, I think so. On the one hand, I agree with you. We've slowed down, and there's been, at least in me, this both kind of happy receiving of that, and then also this degree of whether it's worry or I don't know, guilt maybe of like, but I was supposed to be doing all this stuff, and I think there's again that sense of God on the one hand. This is where the experience of spaciousness within limits, I guess, is sometimes paradoxical, where we don't always feel it in the moment. Like I did not. I had a similar experience to you with small children where it was like, I don't really want to be here. Like I would like to be writing books. Yeah. And this does not seem to be contributing to that goal. And I don't feel very good at what I'm doing.
Yeah, for sure.
And it's been glorious for them to start going to school for me. But I really enjoy my children and whatever. I now can look back and say God was very much like doing a lot in me that was really good at that time. But it did feel like being in a box, even though what it actually was like opening up a doorway.
For sure.
And I'm curious to hear, because I think one of the things you write about is that God, in and of his own self, like offers us a model of a life of limitation, which sounds, again, like, what do you mean God is limited? But I'm curious if you could just talk a little bit about God as a model of the goodness of limits.
Jesus chose to take on limits, right? He chose to enter into the world through the incarnation and took on a body and, was born through Mary's womb and lived in a particular spot of land and particular time. And what's fascinating too is that, in his ascension, it's not that he becomes spirit, right? He will always be a body because of that. And he will the wounds of the crucifixion and in heaven. And he's also choosing to wait until all of his church, the bride, is reunited and we all get to feast together before he's drinking wine and celebrating with everybody. And that is just amazing to think that the second person of the Trinity took on limits to show us how we could be human. It's mind boggling, right? But it's true. And we could see, even in our own lives, we know that to love someone well means that we are accepting constraints, right? That we are emptying the dishwasher, even though we don't want to, because we know that it serves our spouse, or, we're changing a diaper, or we are driving our children around to practices, or we are inviting people into our home from our church community, even if we don't feel like having people over and we'd rather just watch a show. And, these are the sorts of things that we realize love often flourishes because of constraints. And without them, without those limits, we really wouldn't have love. It would just be everyone serving themselves.
Right. We would just be like autonomous individuals who take care of our own needs rather than actually giving and receiving to one another. Yeah.
And so, we see Jesus accepting the limits of his body. He sleeps in a boat. We see Jesus, bringing a ragtag group of disciples together from all areas of society. We see him healing people, and he's not healing everybody. And he has 12 disciples, right? There's limits in his attention and in his calling. He's primarily ministering in Jewish places. And he's also, choosing to wait on God the Father when he's tempted in the desert. He's not going, okay, great. I'm hungry. I should feed myself. Satan, you're right. He's saying, no, I'm going to wait on God the Father. I'm not going to hurry ahead and hustle ahead. And then he also, in Gethsemane, particularly, he is subsuming his will to the plan of redemption that the triune God came up with before time and space were a thing. And, he, in that garden, he does what our first parents in the first garden failed to do, right? They they move beyond their limits of what God said was good. Jesus abides within those limits, even if it means death. But then what's so beautiful, right, is that there is the resurrection that, and that means, I think, if the pattern of our lives looks like Jesus, is that there will always be resurrection, whether it's now or, someday in the future, there will be restoration. And so our limits don't have to pinch maybe quite as much.
So how do you think we know what our limits are? Are they obvious things that we're just trained to not see, or do we have to go through a process of discovery? Is there anything you've learned about how to know what our limits are? And the reason I ask this is because I do think, as women in particular, and maybe even more so as Christian women, it's really easy to learn how to be small. Just, kind of old tapes of women belong in the home, you're supposed to be serving. And so you could say well, those are just my natural limits, right? And I just need to receive those from the Lord and learn how to be content in the midst of all things, just like Paul said, right? And I don't think that's what you're saying.
Yeah.
But so I also think and so then we've got a cultural narrative that's lean in, you can have it all. And I don't think that's that certainly has not worked for me. I can say that much. And I do think that's the problem of Adam and Eve in the garden is trying to have it all. and live without limits. But I'm also curious, like that process of discernment of when we are being called to essentially say, no, go for it. Like God, know that God is with you as you kind of confidently advance into whatever area of giftedness or opportunity is in front of you. And when to say, you know what, this is just a time for like rest, sacrifice, waiting, whatever it is. And maybe it's simply like pray about it. But I'm just wondering if you have any advice or like, here are some things to think about, something, any way you've learned how to discern.
I mean, that's a great question. I think one thing, so my husband's a pastor, and one thing when he was first ordained about 15 years ago, that part of it in the process was not just do you have a degree and do you information, of course, but what is your internal sense of call and what is your external sense of call? And I think that's really important, not only for pastors, but for all of us, that it's not just like, I have these great ideas and I'm just going to go write a book, right? Like I'm going to be a famous author or whatever people have this maybe internal desire to do. But that there is also an external validation of that call. The community that knows you well, your local neighborhood, your local church. Is there a sense in which, as was it Walter Brueggemann, who's talked about your desire and the world's hunger meet, right? Is kind of how we can think about vocation. Stephen Garber talks about vocation in terms of given how I'm made and knowing what I know, what is my responsibility? What am I implicated in? What am I responsible for? So that I am bringing the care of Christ to the world. And I think I really like some of that language because I think it's hard because a lot of women are going to shirk their calling because it feels safer to accept these kind of cultural limits. Right. And a lot of women and men too, are going to be like, bust ahead and, try to bypass these limits and like go out and take it for themselves. So I would say probably don't act on it immediately, take some time to pray and consider and to pay attention to your local communities. Where you are, maybe just as a starting point, because I think we all approach those limits really differently. But don't do it on your own. Don't just try to discern calling on your own, because that's just kind of playing into our current cultural narrative. Like I find out who I am by looking at myself, and I look in myself to find out who I am, and we're just circularly autonomous. It's not working out.
And that kind of leads me to my next question, which is I do believe there's a difference between what you're writing about and kind of like self-care life hacks. At the same time, I could make a list of things that I read about in your book, learning how to wait, learning how to rest, noticing your body. And I could also find those on like a list of self-care hacks, right? Like, what makes an approach different than just that insular, I'm just looking at myself? Like, how can we do that in a way that is not completely self-referential?
Yeah. A lot of the book started in a little bit anger with some of that self-help language, especially a lot of it that had been whitewashed as Christian content, because I feel like that's pretty anti-gospel to be like, really, you need to go create your own life and get out there and do it. And that's American. Right. Exactly. Yeah. Nope. That will really only leave exhausted and usually blown up your life in some way, shape or form. But that's a really great point about the ways in which you can have on the surface similar sorts of activities, right? That might result from those sorts of things. And I guess a lot of the question is, what is it directed towards? Am I taking a nap? Like I am plugging in my iPhone, so that I can go get after it after I take my nap, or, am I taking a nap because I, have overworked or because I deserve it, so what is the message underneath the activity? Or am I taking a nap because I'm trying to actually put my body in a position of declaring that God is God and he doesn't need me right now to run the world. And, and some of that might be even just like, thank you, God, that you care for me and watch over me as I sleep, and I'm going to go to bed now. And so even just trying to reorient maybe some of our innate habits that come out when we're, I think a lot of it too, we can pay attention to our anger, the things that make us angry or frustrated or sad, and that those can be good kind of arrows pointing to help us know, am I really angry about the messy house because I want a world of order and care. And I know this is better for us, or am I angry about it because it's like, I've done all this work and my children have messed it all up. And, and so I think just some of those sorts of questions are helpful to kind of discern the states of our soul.
Yeah, that's helpful. So I'm hearing you say like motivations matter, and then like paying attention to the emotions that go along with actions. And then when you were talking, I also was just thinking about the ways in which self-care, even if we are not ever referencing God as it relates to that, doesn't mean that we're not doing something that God would want for us. It's not a bad thing to actually say, I'm going to take care of what I need for myself. Like that's a part of being a responsible person who acknowledges, perhaps with some humility, that I've been created with limits, even if I'm not doing that in a way that is like prayerful and contemplative. All the better if I'm actually doing that in some kind of full awareness of how God has made me. But at the same time, I have recently just thought a lot about like love your neighbor as you love yourself, and that sense that if you don't know how to love yourself, like you may very well not know how to love your neighbor. Like that sense of if you don't regard the image of God in you with attentiveness and care and like being deserving of, and not just even deserving of, requiring care and whatever it takes to live within those limits, then it's going to be pretty hard to actually bring that love into the world all the same.
Yeah. Yeah.
You had another point in the book where you're writing about community. I just wanted to quote one thing you wrote. You're writing about the idea of being salt. So this, image from the Bible of little grains of salt. And you talk about how like one grain of salt is kind of absurd. Like it's just not purposeful. Whereas salt gathered, even in small quantities, but gathered together, serves a lot of different purposes. So you wrote, to be the gathered salt of God, we must consent to the constraints of community, of being for others instead of using others, often through limiting our times, desires, and even those secondary identities we hold dear. So I just want to read the first line again. To be the gathered salt of God, we must consent to the constraints of community. And I love, like, up until this point, I feel like we've been talking about kind of limits that are within ourselves as individuals. Like, oh, I need to sleep. And I didn't really understand that when I was in college. Or, oh, I need to, I have these things that I can't just push through. But the constraints of community are something different. And I'd love for you to speak to the goodness of the constraints of community. And then again, like, how do we actually realize that? And this in some ways goes back to your last book too, but like the goodness of where we are now and the people we're with now, especially when it sometimes seems kind of like small and mundane. But could you just speak to that?
Yeah. It wasn't until recently, as I was talking about the book, that I realized, another way to that I've organized this book that I didn't even know is like the first half is kind of like loving God, like, like ourselves and loving God. And the second is like, it's about loving neighbor. I was like, oh, look at that. I didn't even know that happened, but there it goes. But, I think a lot of it looks like, Jesus invites us into the constraints, particularly of the church, kind of as our first and new family. So we can live for the life of the world. If you think about, way back in the beginning, God calls Abraham and he says, like, I'm going to make you a people so that you can bless the nations. And the point of community, isn't like, so we make a really cool community. The point of community is to actually bless our world, wherever we are. But what often I think when we talk about limits is sometimes some of us can hear that and we can be like, okay, so that means I get to say no to everything I don't want to do. Right. That I'm going to put up all these really hard boundaries. And then my life will be great. Just meet Jesus or what have you. But really, I think it's important to realize that some of the limits that we're being invited into don't feel good, and that they're not like, they don't feel like flourishing, like you were talking about, like feeling trapped, in those early mothering years. And sometimes we say yes to the wrong limits, and we say no to the ones, that maybe God is inviting us into. And so I think a lot of that is just discernment, and to ask her, to like, are the limits that I am living into, ones that are a blessing to other people, to my neighborhood, place, to my family, to my community. And that does bring me back, to my first book, Finding Holy in the Suburbs, where, part of like staying put doesn't feel good or sexy or fun. But to choose to say, I'm going to be a good neighbor. I'm going to stay here, and I'm going to continue to try to make small talk, even though I don't like small talk, or I'm going to, put myself out there and try to meet new people, even though that's not really what I'd rather do. Or I'm going to continue to repair a relationship with a neighbor who's just angry about my tree or my kids, or, whatever it is. That then shows a certain form of love that is not self-serving, that therefore is something beautiful, and maybe probably makes people ask good questions about, like, why are you like that? And I think then you can begin to have conversations about faith as well. So I think the constraints of community make us effective, and they really show that there is a love that is greater than our self-love too.
And I think this is another, I don't know historically whether it would be 100 years ago, 50 years ago, when the constraints of community started to feel more like choices. Because now I think about, we live in a 3,000 person town, and there are a couple of churches here, but they are all small, local Connecticut churches. And I remember when we got here, and I had all these friends living in cities where it was like, there are so many churches, and they're big, and they've got a lot on offer. I'm like, well, and we kind of chose a church, and it's like, they're going to be, I don't know, maybe 60 people in the pews. And the majority of them are going to be over the age of 65. And the children's, there might be my kids in Sunday school this week. That's it. Or maybe there will be like 3 more. And the choir is lovely. And who knows who's going to show up? Like, it's just this sense of like, but it has been, for my husband and for me, over the course of, now we're going into our 10th year here, the most rich church community we've ever had. And it's not an exceptional church. It's not a spectacular church. It's not like, oh my gosh, this is the best preaching, or this is the best, like, I've never known anyone to pray like that. It's not that. It's just ordinary people who are gathering with a commitment to each other, sometimes on Sunday mornings, and I've been so struck. I was so struck in thinking about the benefits to our family of being in this like tremendously constrained church community. And then I think that can obviously go into the sense of like, okay, just choose to love your neighbors, or your town, or your school, or what does it mean to actually take what you've been given and live within that, and see what God wants to do with it, and trust God with that. So anyway, I really appreciated that idea.
No, that's great. Yeah, I think it's so countercultural, and it can feel like you're trapped, especially if you can look out over the internet vistas of like different, oh, well, look at that person's preaching, and they're amazing, and they've got all of these programs and activities. But even sociological data, right, talks about, how does faith get passed down? And it's from families, right? And it's from communities that are like families. It's not for all the flashy stuff that we tend to consume. And I think that's good news for those of us who say it is a wise limit to stay put and to commit to this people.
Right. Right. And I think back again just to the many times when Jesus is talking about the way the kingdom of God comes into the world, the way it spreads and grows. And it's these small, slow, humble, mustard seed, yeast, images of domestic scenes. And there is just this sense of the hidden and the lowly being of great value to God. and that there is something that we receive in those places that will actually draw us closer to God's heart and farther, I think, into a sense of a spaciousness that comes not from the spectacular, not from the limitless choice, not from getting everything we want and leaning in and being ambitious, but actually from receiving the good gifts God has given us and being able to give from who we are and who we've been created to be in return.
I think you're right.
So I mentioned to you before we started recording that I have been doing a lot of thinking and writing around the topic of healing right now. And I was drawn to your book when I just saw the title, because it does seem to me that part of our healing on a more like spiritual and emotional level is finding out, discovering this idea that there are spacious places given to us by God, created for us by God within our limits. And so I'm just thinking about some of the things you write about: gratitude, hospitality, rest. And when I look at the stories of healing in the Gospels, even in these miracle stories of Jesus healing people, there is a sense of like there's a story of the 10 lepers, and one of them comes back to give thanks to Jesus. And he's the only one who is actually, the word in Greek says that he's healed in like a comprehensive sense. The rest of them, their skin is all better, but he's the only one who's actually healed. And it's in that act of gratitude and like connecting to Jesus that the healing happens. Or thinking about hospitality, which again, that sense of Jesus like connecting people to each other as a part of healing. It's not just like, I'm going to send you out as an isolated individual, but I'm going to connect you to each other. And then similarly, rest. I don't know if this is true or not, but I'm curious whether one of the reasons Jesus keeps insisting on healing on the Sabbath day is because of like some relationship between healing and rest. And obviously there's worship. There are other things involved there. But anyway, I'm curious whether you see a connection between living within our limits and receiving like the healing work that God wants to be doing in our lives.
Yeah. I think one thing as I was reading the Gospels a lot for this book is just to realize that love and healing that Jesus offers all looks like paying attention. And it often looks like, someone, I don't remember where I heard this from. I should probably chase it down. But, someone said that, no one ever left Jesus feeling like unheard. He paid attention, regardless of, if they were the right class or gender or, they were outcasts or what have you. And I think that's, as we think about, okay, what are the kind of housekeeping and caretaking disciplines I can do individually and in community, that there is the opportunity for healing, but only to the extent probably that we learn to pay attention to Jesus, and that, we are practicing silence and rest and Sabbath, and like we are creating spaces for God's healing to come to us and through us to help heal others. We've noticed, I think, we've just recently moved about 4 months ago from California to Colorado, and just coming into a new community and a new church situation, just realizing a lot of our own work that we've done and a lot of failures in life and ministry that we have processed with counselors and spiritual directors, and how it's actually helping to heal people here. Because like we can be attentive in a different way, because of the pain we've caused in the past and repented of, and the pain that has been inflicted on us. It's like opened up a space for us to be attentive to other people, and not know where that's going, and not have a grand plan about what the next step is, but to be able to pay attention to people has been, it's been a gift. And I think we've felt the Spirit accompany us more in those conversations, maybe because we're a little bit less hurried, as well.
Yeah, I do think that sense of opening up space slows us down, which is, I've been saying actually to a friend of mine who homeschooled her children throughout COVID. And they've gone back to school this month. And she is so tired. Like, she's like, I thought I was going to like start getting my life back and all I'm doing is sleeping. And I just have been just continuously being like, he makes me lie down in green pastures. Like, you just need to lie down and like just rest for a while. And I think I love that sense that it is actually when we are willing to receive space, which actually kind of, again, in this almost ironic way, comes from slowing down, stopping even, and waiting, that opens up space for healing to happen. I'm even thinking my daughter like sprained her foot and it wasn't that bad. So it was like, yeah, keep going to soccer practice, keep playing your games. And she's finally like, it just still hurts. Like, I'll keep going, but it just still hurts. And I'm like, I think we need to just take a week off. Like, no PE, no gym, no classes, no whatever. We're going to wrap your foot. And so it has been this week of like sitting around and she's a little antsy, but there's also, that is what actually opens up space and opens up a place for healing. And I wonder how true that is on like, that's kind of a metaphor for what can happen for us personally in our spiritual lives, that if we just can slow down and like make space for God and pay attention, as you were saying, and then also on a communal level, that if we are able to slow down and pay attention to our communities, what space does that open up? Not for like massive church growth programs, but actually for like healing within the community and for care and for goodness. So yeah, I appreciate that connection.
Yeah.
Well, I just wanted to end with one more quotation that I think goes back to a little bit of what we were saying in the beginning, as far as the idea that like limitations is not the same as brokenness. You write, dependence, not independence, is the pathway into a more spacious life. And I, again, have learned that, or am learning that only as an adult, that we have been created in order to be dependent, obviously first upon God, but really upon one another as well. Even though we are taught to, I think, fight against any sense of dependence. And yet that ultimately that is, as you said, a gift and a pathway into a more spacious life. So thank you for offering those just really helpful, thoughtful, wise words to all of us. And I'll just want to say the title of your book one more time. This is Ashley Hales, author of A Spacious Life, Trading Hustle and Hurry for the Goodness of Limits. Thanks, Ashley.
Thanks for having me.
Thanks so much for listening to Love is Stronger Than Fear. In the show notes, as always, you can find out more about Ashley and her book, and I hope you will do that. I also hope you'll share this episode with friends and family and people you know who would also benefit from thinking about what it would mean to really say yes by saying no. I know that sounds kind of cheesy, but I think that sense of recognizing the spaciousness that we are offered when we begin to live in our limits is a message that so many of us so desperately need to actually believe and live out. So I hope you'll share it. Of course, if you have a moment to give a rating or review of this podcast, wherever you find your podcasts, more people will benefit from these conversations. I'd really appreciate it. And I'm always really grateful to Jake Hansen for editing this podcast, and to Amber Beery, who is my just amazing social media coordinator and does pretty much everything needed to make sure this show gets out into the world. So thank you, Jake. Thank you, Amber. And finally, thank you for listening. As you go into your day today, I hope you will carry with you the peace that comes from believing that love is stronger than fear.